So importantly, our panel today actually has a subtitle, which wasn't included on the opening slide. It's Reframing the Visual in Romantic Period Studies. And I'm going to kind of introduce the project upon which this roundtable is based. Maureen, McCue and I are the co-editors of an Edinburgh Companion to Romanticism in the Arts. And we're going to kind of divide our duties today as co-chairs. I'm going to start, I'm going to hand off to Maureen. She's going to hand back to me and I'm going to hand back to her. So it'll be a little bit like, I don't know, Wimbledon, watching the proverbial ball go back and forth. Over the last few decades, scholars of British Romantic literature, many of them I suspect here in our audience today, and thank you all for coming. It's a wonderful group from all over the world. Have become increasingly attuned to the material and cultural contexts in which the period's authors and readers lived and moved. This historical moment, which for our purposes is roughly 1780 to 1840, was a time of rapid change and fruitful experimentation in the fields of both art and literature. For instance, advances in print production encouraged a growing number of readers to engage with a wide range of literary forms that opened up pathways into the visual arts, pathways which had been perhaps not so visible into what had been rather exclusive territory. Meanwhile, writers were instrumental in shaping those emergent as well as evolving visual cultures, including new spaces such as museums and galleries and forms, from portraiture to illustrated books, from miniatures to caricatures. In contemporary scholarship, these cross currents are equally apparent. There are, for example, numerous multidisciplinary approaches to these developments, engaging the fields of book history, museum studies, and cultural history, as well as the history of reading. When Edinburgh University Press approached us about editing a companion to Romanticism and the arts, we jumped at the opportunity, particularly since our own research has been driven by the kinds of intermedial dialogues central to this volume. And it offered us a wonderful opportunity to consolidate as well as disseminate a wide range of really exciting work being done at this time. We're very grateful to BARS for allowing us to offer this roundtable showcasing some of this work in progress. EUP has already published a few companions in this series already, such as Shakespeare in the Arts, Virginia Woolf in the Arts. And the remit of the series is to bring together 30 or so newly commissioned research-led essays covering key bases within the field. I think we have 31 essays, touch wood, at the moment in ours. And although existing companions have tended to treat literature's relationship with all the arts, we decided to capture the way recent engagements with visual studies in particular have reshaped how we understand the boundaries between print and visual culture in the period. So though we have included chapters that treat other art forms such as music and drama, these are also examined through the lens of printed visual culture. I'm going to hand off to Maureen now, who will offer some details about the shape of the volume as we've structured it.
Great, thank you. So the volume is divided into 4 main sections, and the chapters in our first section, which we're calling Contexts, treats foundational concepts that are essential to an understanding of visual and aesthetic discourse in late 18th century Britain, such as the sublime, the picturesque, and the Gothic. Part 2, Culture and Commerce, traces the way in which art moved from being displayed in exclusive private collections into more public and democratic spaces. With an eye for both high and low art, these chapters explore various romantic viewing spaces, such as auction houses, print shops, private galleries, and public exhibitions, and sets them in dialogue with those institutions, societies, artists, and entrepreneurs who shaped contemporary taste. The section as a whole works at opening up wider questions of access and audience. The chapters in section 3, which we've grouped under the title Print Culture and the Arts, consider how the material conditions of book production lent themselves to an intermedial engagement with the visual arts, particularly through a wide range of emergent print-based media, such as magazines and annuals. Although the long-standing debates between the sister arts had favored word over image, these chapters explore how sociable collaborations between poets and painters, publishers and printmakers, and authors and their audiences both fostered and reflected a growing appetite for the visual, while creating spaces for the visual arts to flourish. Our final part, the visual afterlives of Romanticism, examines the ways in which the Romantic period has been and continues to be consumed and understood through visual media, moving from early Victorian remediations of Romantic poetry to the modern graphic novel. We're hoping that this companion, which is due to be published, fingers crossed, next spring, will function as a handbook for those working in this growing field, as it aims to reflect the diversity of the period's engagement with visual culture and its impact on contemporary print culture, not only in elite contexts, but at the level of the domestic and the everyday. So in today's roundtable discussion then, we'll be hearing from 5 of our contributors who will each give us a brief overview of their chapter. Sophie, as we've said, will introduce each speaker in turn, and we'll save time for questions at the end after all the presentations. So, but feel free to pop any questions you have for specific contributors into the chat with the queue, as Matt had pointed out before. So Sophie, over to you then.
Thanks. I have unmuted again, haven't I? Yes. Our first speaker is Laura Engel, and we're going to share the screen for Laura, and so she's going to be cueing me when I need to advance the slide. So apologies if there's any delays there. Laura is a professor of English at Duquesne University and the author of Women, Performance, and the Material of Memory, The Archival Tourist, 1780 to 1915. She's also the author of Fashioning Celebrity and Austen Actresses and Accessories. And the title of her chapter from which she's speaking today is Fashioning Fairies, Allegory and Celebrity in Lady Diana Beauclerk's Watercolors of the Fairy Queen. Over to you, Laura.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Maureen and Sophie, for having me, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to dive right in because I want to stay to my allotted time. So my chapter in Romanticism in the Arts explores Lady Diana Beauclerk's rarely studied large-scale images from Edmund Spenser's epic, The Fairy Queen, completed in 1781 while she was in residence near Horace Walpole's Gothic mansion, Strawberry Hill. Slide 1, please. These remarkable watercolors depict key moments from the epic that focus on Spenser's heroines in action. Borrowing from a variety of styles and techniques, the paintings are a blend of fantastical detail, global iconography, and au courant fashion trends designed to highlight particular aspects of Spenser's narrative. In this way, Beauclerk provides the spectator with a dazzling array of examples of the eclectic nature of 18th century visual culture. In particular, her portrayal of Spenser's Britomart as a powerful Minerva figure capitalizes on the associations between Minerva, the goddess of war and wisdom, and women's intellectual and artistic accomplishments across visual and narrative materials. Beauclerk's representations of female figures in Spenser's indicates that she was not just highlighting feminine virtue and beauty, as was the case with most visual representations of Spenser's heroines, but rather revisiting specific instances of power, agency, and determination in the epic. In doing so, Beauclerk provides new ways of thinking about the role of women artists in the late 18th century. And this is a famous image of her right here by Joshua Reynolds. So just a bit about Beauclerk. The daughter of Charles Spencer III, Duke of Marlborough, Diana Beauclerk grew up a child of privilege living in the cavernous Blenheim Palace. Despite her aristocratic title, her father's debts and the family's lavish lifestyle made it necessary for her and her sisters to marry into money. Diana Beauclerk's advantageous and tumultuous marriage to Lord Bolingbroke resulted in a very public separation and divorce. She left him for the handsome Topham Beauclerk, who subsequently died, leaving Lady Diana at liberty to pursue her artistic career full-time. This fortunate freedom, coupled with her proximity to Horace Walpole, his important circle of literati and artistic friends, and his exceptional house, Strawberry Hill, contributed to the ways in which her work flourished from the 1780s until her death in 1808. She worked in an impressive variety of media, including pastel, watercolor, interior design, wax, and porcelain. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Fairy Queen was subject of paintings and engravings by a number of artists, including Benjamin West, Joshua Reynolds, Henry Fuseli, and Angelica Kauffman. But in terms of illustration, however, Beauclerk's watercolors appear to be the only set of pictures potentially created for publication made to accompany the epic, aside from William Kent's images completed in 1751. And although these watercolors were largely unseen by both her contemporaries and by modern scholars, today they're housed in large drawers in the Lewis Walpole Library, but you can also find them digitally online. I argue that we can understand them as cleverly staged advertisements for Beauclerk's work. Beauclerk's ghosting of herself in various places in her Fairy Queen images creates a visual archive of self-representation. She invites viewers to engage in different ways of reading. If we pay close attention to the visual details in the picture, we can find representations of the literary nuances of the text, particularly in relation to the agency of the central heroines. But at the same time, close attention to the images reveals the talents of the artist herself in very particular ways. So in doing so, Beauclerk's watercolors of the Fairy Queen represent a particular aesthetic strategy of illusion and intermediality designed to navigate the murky and ambiguous terrain between the amateur female artist and the legitimate working professional. So two brief examples I'm going to go through. Next slide, please. The following illustration from Book 3, Canto 9, lines 22 to 23, features Britomart standing center stage, revealing herself as a dazzlingly beautiful woman to the astonished Artegal. In the passage from the epic, which I don't have time to read, Spenser represents Britomart here as a fascinating creature. She is male and female, captivating and frightening, Minerva and Medusa. The power she wields to transfix others by her beauty is both celebrated and potentially dangerous. Britomart's theatrical role as a Minerva figure becomes a sign for the dramatic significance of Beauclerk's performance as an artist and creative muse. Beauclerk's representations of figures dressed in armor resemble works by Angelica Kauffman, one of the only women admitted to the Academy, such as her self-portrait with a bust of Minerva. That's the next slide. And also the next slide, her Armida in vain endeavors with her entreaties to prevent Rinaldo's departure. In addition, Scudamore's shield in the image, I think the next slide, thank you. Okay. Scudamore's shield is embellished with a winged cherub that closely resembles the porcelain designs of Cupids and putti that Beauclerk would later produce for Wedgwood. Next slide. And this is a close-up of the putti on the shield, and then also a design of hers for Wedgwood. So the putti figure functions as a kind of 18th century pop-up meme. Highlighting a moment in the epic that foregrounds Britomart as a Minerva figure, and including a visual reference to her own artistic design, one that could potentially be lucrative for her in the future, may have been part of Beauclerk's clever strategy to advertise herself and her work through the Fairy Queen images. Next slide. Beauclerk's representation in Book 6, Canto 9 contains the most strategic reference to her own work. In this scene depicting Pastorella on a hill, surrounded by lovely lasses and lusty shepherds, Beauclerk inserts a replica of her own portraits of her daughters in the foreground. Beauclerk's large pastel of her young daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, captures them in a moment of reading and discussion. Next slide, please. And this is her portrait of her daughters, and then an image, a close-up image from the Fairy Queen. One of her daughters holds up her hand, gesturing with a finger, as if the two are deep in conversation. In the Spenser watercolor, the two females, dressed in late 18th century fashionable garb, are similarly seated together. Although they do not have a book in this scene, one of the figures holds up her hand to make a point with her finger, mimicking the iconography Beauclerk uses in her portrait of Mary and Elizabeth. Beauclerk's original pastel of her daughters became an instant sensation when the well-known printmaker Bartolozzi reimagined the scene by placing the two girls on a long couch surrounded by an ornate curtain. And we're going to go to the next slide. That's the image again, and then the next slide. Thank you. In addition to figures that mimic Mary and Elizabeth, the central heroine in the Spencer image, Pastorella, is similar to Beauclerk's widely circulated image of Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, which is pictured here as well, also engraved by Bartolozzi. The fact that Bartolozzi engravings appeared in 1779 and 1780, just as Beauclerk was composing the Fairy Queen series, suggests that she carefully positioned references to her past works within Spencer's landscape. So Beauclerk's visual archive of her family and her artwork within Spencer's world marks a deliberate strategy. Weaving references to her original composition into episodes of Fairy Queen, staging iconographic echoes of Kaufman, particularly to the figure of Minerva as a mirror for Britomart, female artistry, and Britain, provided Beauclerk with useful methods for fashioning her celebrity in her newfound freedom after the death of her second husband. Beauclerk may have been considered to be an amateur artist, but her watercolors of the Fairy Queen signal the possibility that she wished to be taken seriously as a legitimate professional. Thank you.
Wonderful, Laura. Thank you very much. Thank you. And our next speaker, I can slide forward for a moment, is Alison O'Byrne. And I'm going to stop sharing, Alison, because you're going to start, aren't you? And we'll just have a smooth handover here. Alison O'Byrne is Senior Lecturer in the Department of English and the Centre for 18th Century Studies at York, and has wide-ranging interests in representations of the city in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The title of her chapter is Public Improvement as National Ornament, Commerce, Culture and Patriotism in London and Edinburgh. Welcome, Alison.
Right. Thanks very much first to Sophie and Maureen for inviting me to take part in the volume, as well as to share an aspect of the research today. So as Sophie mentioned, my contribution to the volume looks at the relationship between art, commerce, and patriotism as expressed through the urban built environment in London and Edinburgh during the Romantic period. And my talk today will look briefly at Calton Hill in Edinburgh, looking first at a view from the hill and then a view of the hill. So this first image here is an engraving after J.M.W. Turner's Edinburgh from Calton Hill. Calton Hill's place in Edinburgh's development as a cultural and aesthetic capital is linked in part to the vantage point from the summit of the hill, which offers a wide-ranging survey, one that played an important role in the development of technologies of seeing. It was home to Thomas Short's observatory from 1776. It was from Calton Hill that Robert Barker invented the panorama in the 1780s. It was here that Maria Theresa Short, who claimed to be the legal heir of Thomas Short, first exhibited her camera obscura. And it was on Calton Hill that the pioneering photographer David Octavius Hill established his studio in the 1840s, and views of and from the hill feature in his work. The panoramic perspective from the summit took in an important history of nationhood, symbolized, for example, by Holyrood House and Edinburgh Castle, bringing it into dialogue with modernization projects like the New Town and the commercial interests of Leith Harbour. While the view offered a survey of the visual contrast between the old town and the new, it never simply reduced this juxtaposition to a triumph of the latter over the former. Instead, as John Lowry notes, commentators drew attention to, quote, the distinctiveness yet interconnectedness of the two parts of the city and their relationship with the picturesque. In his Provincial Antiquities and Picturesque Scenery of Scotland of 1826, Walter Scott celebrated the pleasing succession of views made available to those strolling on the hill, proclaiming that, quote, the promenade in its excessive richness of beautiful objects and the numerous moral associations which they are calculated to excite is perhaps unequaled in Europe or in the world. Scott's account of Calton Hill is illustrated by this engraving after Turner. Scott introduces the image as undertaking, quote, a daring representation of one of the most magnificent scenes in this romantic city. Taken from that point, quote, upon which every passenger, however much accustomed to the wonderful scene, is inclined to pause and, with eyes unsatisfied with seeing, to gaze on the mingled and almost tumultuous scene which lies before and beneath him. While almost serves as an important qualifier here, Scott in this quotation draws attention to the varied and dramatic landscape and the clash of architectural styles that come together to define the Romantic city. As he surveys the scene, he draws the reader's attention to the Gothic jail down here on the left, designed by Robert Adam, the Calton burial ground just next to it, and where you can see Adam's monument to David Hume in the corner, the magnificent Regent's Bridge just here, whose colonnades kind of mimic those outside of the cemetery, the North Bridge, which connects the Old Town and the New Town, and then finally, at the back, the castle, as he puts it, predominating over the whole. In architectural terms, this mingled scene brings together Gothic and Classical, as well as Old and New, with ongoing building work signaled by the long shed just here in front of the burial ground. At the same time, the view is firmly localized by the activities and figures in the foreground, which includes a man in black watch regimentals just down here in the corner, women wearing tartan, and laundry laying out to dry. The inclusion of ordinary people in mundane activities highlights that this is not the organizing and ordering perspective of wealth and status in a view from a private house or estate, but one that's available to anyone. The landscape displayed in Turner's view is a conglomeration of somewhat disparate parts, and it is rooted in a tradition of landscape art in which, as John Barrell explains, quote, the past and present compete for attention, where the local is at odds with the national, where values are affirmed because somewhere else they are being called into question, where different versions of what Britain should be grind against each other. Whereas the view from Calton Hill in Turner's painting presents a landscape which can be read as a contested site, views of the top of the hill are ostensibly more conducive to confident statements about the city and nation. So my next image is a view of the top of the hill undertaken by George Meikle Kemp. As John Lowry suggests, the Greek Revival buildings and monuments constructed between 1818 and 1831 on top of Calton Hill played a key role in, quote, establishing an identity within the political realities of the British state in a city that was the capital of a nation that had lost its statehood. These architectural works signal a departure from the first buildings constructed on the site. Short's Observatory, built in 1776 in Gothic style, which is out of view here, and the castellated Nelson Monument, which you can see here, constructed between 1807 and 1815. The shift to Greek Revival designs after this point can be understood in terms of a broader cultural narrative about Edinburgh's status as the inheritor of the classical past. The Gothic jail that was pictured in Turner's view, and which you can see here, constructed in 1818 in the style of what Scott referred to as an ancient citadel, is the one notable exception to this trend. The first of these constructions, William Henry Playfair's Greek Revival Observatory, built in 1818 and just about visible, kind of jutting out here from behind the Nelson Monument, was designed as a temple of the winds with porticos facing in each direction, to which was added a monument to Playfair's uncle, the scientist and mathematician John Playfair, constructed in 1825 to 26. Thomas Hamilton's Royal High School, the large building in the center here, was constructed between 1825 and 29 and referenced the Hephaestion, a temple on the Acropolis dedicated to the god of fire, metalworking, and crafts, while his monument to the poet Robert Burns, the large one in the foreground here, at the right of the image, and Playfair's monument to the philosopher Dugald Stewart, up here to the left of the Nelson Monument, were both based on the choragic monument of the Socrates, built near the Acropolis to house the trophy he was awarded in a choral contest. Taken together, these structures announced Edinburgh's claims to be the Athens of the North, forming a collection of public buildings and monuments to famous Scots connected with mathematics and science, philosophy, and poetry, thereby asserting the city's reputation as a seat of learning. The boldest architectural statement of Edinburgh's self-proclaimed status as the modern Athens, however, was the never completed National Monument, which you can see in about the center here. The structure was intended as a full-scale reconstruction of the Parthenon from plans developed by Charles R. Cockrell based on his extensive study of its ruins during his grand tour, with William Henry Playfair appointed to oversee the project in Edinburgh while Cockrell remained in London. In the wave of patriotism that followed victory in the Napoleonic Wars, discussions about a national monument for Scotland's war heroes began to take place. For the lawyer and historian Archibald Alison, such a monument was key to ensuring Edinburgh's continued relevance as a capital city. To give precedence to London on such a matter as this, he argued, would have detrimental effects both on the progress of the arts and to the ongoing cultivation of British as well as Scottish martial pride. While, quote, it is quite right that the Scots should glory with their aged sovereign in the name of Britain, it is also the case that, quote, the animating effects which the sight of a national trophy is fitted to have on a martial people would be entirely lost in this country if no other monument to Scottish valor existed than the monument at London, a project which itself never came to fruition. A prominent memorial of this kind, Alison argues, would, quote, attract the attention of the most thoughtless, the young, the gay, and the active, who naturally fill the ranks of the army, and who are unlikely to be inspired by a written historical record of the achievements of the moment. Such a monument would also see Scotland engaging England in a friendly cultural rivalry, one that could propel key developments in the arts in both countries. The decision to build a full-scale reconstruction of the Parthenon is presented in debates about the national monument as an act of cultural rescue. The project is frequently described as a restoration of the Parthenon, preserving ancient Greek architecture for future generations. But the project runs into financial and other difficulties and grinds to a halt after only 12 columns are constructed. Whereas in London, acts of improvement and commemoration broadly consolidated a narrative of military, economic, and cultural prestige, in Edinburgh, as Ian Duncan notes, the city's extraordinary civic confidence generated ideas of, quote, a national identity split between a political and economic dimension, imperial union, and a supplemental cultural one, national distinctiveness. Understanding Edinburgh's continuing relevance as a capital city required a careful presentation of its cultural achievements, one that set it apart from, yet positioned it as a friendly rival to London. The split between imperial union and national distinctiveness identified by Duncan may have undermined the National Monument project, its unfinished state pointing in part to the difficulties of articulating a Scottish sense of Britishness via a national monument. As James Coleman notes, the failure of the National Monument project is an exception in a period when, quote, the Scots surrounded themselves with all the signs and symbols of a culturally and historically coherent nation. Standing now, as it was left in 1829, the National Monument appears, in the words of an 1834 guidebook, as a magnificent modern ruin. This obtrusive conjoining of a state of incompleteness and ruin, whereby an unfinished reconstruction of the Parthenon ends up echoing the fragmented condition of the original, reminds us of the ways in which discussions about the appearance of London and Edinburgh, which called up Rome and Athens, respectively, also imagined what the monuments and public buildings of the present might say to future generations. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alison. That was wonderful. And you have to hear the virtual clapping. All of you will have a big round of virtual clapping, I think, at the end as well. Our next speaker is Kacie Wills. Kacie's going to share her screen, and I'll introduce her while she's doing the business. Kacie is assistant professor of English at Illinois College and is the co-editor of the book Women in the Art and Science of Collecting in 18th Century Europe, which just appeared last year from Routledge. The title of her chapter is Visualizing the Indigenous Pacific, the Oh My Costuming for the Pantomime Oh My, or a Trip Around the World.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie and Maureen. It's such a pleasure to be in this compendium, and thank you all for being here. I actually have a brief land acknowledgement statement I'm going to drop in the chat really quickly here. Just recognizing the land and the people to whom it belongs to from where I'm presenting. In about 1753, a man named Mai was born in Raiatea to a family of middling rank. In the early 1760s, Raiatea was invaded by the Bora-Borans, resulting in the exile of Mai and others to the island of Tahiti, notably also the Polynesian priest and navigator Tupaia, who I also discuss in the longer version of this chapter. This event set the stage for the encounters between Mai and the individuals associated with the Cook voyages. The 3 voyages of Captain James Cook to the Pacific, taking place between 1768 and 1780, made a distinct mark on the global imagination and popular culture through the groundbreaking length of their stay in the Pacific Islands and their extended contact with Pacific peoples. The visual representations afforded by these encounters continue to shape Western understanding of the Pacific and the known histories of Mai and other indigenous envoys, to borrow a term from Kate Fullagar. For many Europeans, the printed illustrations in voyage and exploration accounts were their only context for understanding the shifts in science and knowledge that resulted from contact in the Pacific and indeed around the globe. Along with these illustrations, other visual representations, such as paintings and pantomimes, served to mediate knowledge for the public, represent Pacific indigenous populations to European audiences, and disseminate ideas about the reach and power of the British Empire. The costuming illustration for the Omai character in the popular 18th century pantomime, Omai, or A Trip Around the World, highlights the ways Mai's indigeneity was visually mediated in order to situate him as envoy to the Pacific. This illustration is especially significant since no contemporary illustrations of the Omai character's costuming were thought to exist. As recently as 2019, an article on the costuming for the pantomime claimed that no contemporary descriptions or illustrations of the costuming for this character could be found. This may have been in part because it's not with the other pantomime costuming illustrations at the National Library of Australia, Canberra, or at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tangaroa in Wellington. Rather, this illustration, held in a private collection until 2015, is now at the Mitchell Library of the State Library of New South Wales. The examination of this illustration and its relationship to other popular images of the Pacific circulating in print during this period reveals the influence of public consumption on the mediation of knowledge about the Pacific and its indigenous populations. First performed at Covent Garden on the 20th of December, 1785, Omai, or A Trip Around the World, was noted as a, quote, celebrated pantomime, and it was revived after its first run in March 1788. It was a production that both visually reflected and continued to shape the public's ideas of the Pacific, for which Mai stood in as representative. The pantomime displays tension that existed in such popular visual spectacles between the claim that the work was communicating with empirical accuracy and the reality that all such depictions were both fueling and responding to an imaginative vision of Pacific life and culture made popular through print publication. This illustration of the character Omai's costuming for the pantomime, clearly modeled on the famous Portrait of Omai by Joshua Reynolds, depicts Mai's indigenous identity in an increasingly mediated form that highlights what was deemed acceptable and assimilable to the audience. Though still represented as exotic, this orientalized and classicized depiction of indigeneity was more familiar to Europeans than that of the newly encountered Pacific. This drawing style is different from the other known costuming illustrations from this pantomime, and it includes sketches of the set and other characters in the background, which is not common with the other illustrations. The fact that this illustration in the hand of Philip James de Lutherberg, or perhaps another artist, it's attributed to de Lutherberg, but it's not exactly clear if he was the artist. Shows the costuming to be clearly modeled after the Reynolds portrait, though the Omai character is inaccurately labeled as a, quote, native of the Sandwich Islands. This supports previous claims about the liberty taken in representing the dress and setting of the Pacific Islands, even as they were mediated in the accounts and illustrations offered by the Cook voyages. While the costuming of other figures associated with the voyages bears some resemblance to the sartorial practices of the communities on which they are based, the drive to present Mai's nobility and status through the excesses of bark cloth and the classical styling of his garments overrides accuracy. The character's clothing, tapa fashioned in a European, albeit orientalized style, complete with a cloak, reflects not his own culture, but the hybrid, classicized vision of Pacific indigeneity that enlightened England had deemed more appropriate in its degree of otherness. As the envoy charged with bringing European culture and civilization back to the Pacific, Mai must be represented in the pantomime in such a way as to set him apart from others who did not make the journey to England. Since pantomimes were exceedingly topical, Such a performance was the perfect setting for both illustrating popular ideas about the Pacific and establishing Mai as its representative. According to Nicholas Thomas, nativeness as European culture appropriates aspects of indigenous culture becomes an idea signified by objects external to the body rather than the body itself. We see this in the illustration for the Omai character's costuming, from the hints at his tattoos, represented by the small dots on his hands, to the wooden headrest he carries on his arm, the ceremonial paddle he holds with his other hand, and what appears to be a Maori hand club hanging by his side. Interestingly, none of the objects Mai carries in this illustration are significant to the plot of the pantomime. These are, however, objects through which the public would have recognized his identity and status in the Pacific, especially since a number of the props for the pantomime were drawn from objects in British collections and popular print illustrations. The wooden headrest the character holds is similar to the one depicted in the popular engraving of Mai by Francesco Bartolozzi after Nathaniel Dance from 1774. Drawings of hand clubs and oars were circulated with voyage accounts such as that of John Hawksworth. The items the Omai character carries appear to represent various Pacific peoples, including the Maori. These objects then further emphasize Mai's role as envoy to, as well as from the Pacific Islands, at the same time that they speak to the influence of popular print culture on the design of visual spectacles like the pantomime. Red feathers are singled out in Cook's published journals as items of singular importance to the Otaheite people. At the end of the play, the character Omai is declared by the mad prophet Itu to be the owner of 50 red feathers. The feathers bear a significance that is unexplained to the audience of the play, but which they must most likely recognize, but perhaps not fully understand, from having knowledge of Cook's journals. The feathers and their significance uphold Omai's power when he returns to his island. The visual representation of objects such as feathers demonstrates both the captivation with the spectacle of the exotic and the simplification of nativeness in applying meaning to the objects that only partially accesses their cultural significance. Contrasting the depiction of the red feathers in the pantomime with the Omai costuming illustration shows how the feathers were made into sartorial accessories, adorning the character's garments rather than being depicted as object of significance like the other items he holds. The feathers simply accent his turban and his cape, pointing to his desired status. The Omai character's footwear is especially striking in this illustration. His stockings and his shoes stand in contrast to the other character's bare feet and to his own bare legs and feet in the Reynolds portrait, and are reminiscent of the European dress in the early 18th century Vrel's portrait of Mohawk leader Tianin Hogaro, another indigenous envoy who had sought an alliance with England and the aid of Queen Anne and the British military against the French. It is of note that Mai's motivations for visiting England were similar. He desired weapons and support from the British in defeating the Bora Borans who had invaded his home. This illustration of Mai not only demonstrates the interaction of print and visual culture with the design of the pantomime, but also the legacy of visually representing indigenous envoys through specific sartorial signifiers. Mai's legacy continues to serve as a reminder of the significant role indigenous persons played in the circulation of knowledge and ideas about the self and the world heading into the Romantic era, as well as the importance of working to uncover indigenous concepts of narrative representation that, as Caroline Wiegington argues, exist within European printed books and collections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kacie. Thank you very, very much. Our fourth speaker is Ian Haywood, who is well known to many of you, having been the former president of BARS. He's professor of English at Roehampton, the author of several books on caricature in the period, and the co-editor of Romanticism in Illustration. The title of his chapter and mini talk today is Mired in Print, Romantic Writers and Caricature.
Sorry, I just realised I had to mute myself before I shared screen. It's the problem with the technology, isn't it? Just a second, here we go again. Many thanks to Maureen and Sophie for inviting me to contribute to the book, and particularly because when they asked me if I'd do portraits of romantic writers, I felt I'd been handed kind of hallowed ground, which I then realized I couldn't possibly write about. So I said, well, I'll write about romantic portraits of romantic writers if I can do it in my own way, which, as you can see here, means seeing this through the lens of caricature. So what I came up with, I'm just going to set my timer as well so I don't stray over the time limit, was, now this is fresh from, so this is me behaving in the book, if you take my meaning. So this is an actual preview of the first chapter. I didn't see anything wrong with giving you this by way of a trailer. I won't be reading a script for the rest of the talk, but as you can see here, what I'm doing is using caricature to come at this subject from a hopefully a fresh angle. And one of the things it brings out for me is the highly conventional nature of the portraits in general, and the literary portrait in particular. And I've described it here as having a rather static iconography, rather staid and static, you know, this kind of paraphernalia that you get of authorship. And this has got to be contrasted with the way that caricature looks at these things, which in many ways I'm going to claim does give you an insight into what literary portraits actually suppress. And that is the whole point of them, basically, is to suppress, if you like, the kind of story up to that point, the infrastructure, in fact, of print culture in action. And of course, caricature is coming at this from a rather debunking angle. So it makes a rather extreme statement in terms of producing sort of antitypes of literary portraits. But I think there's a lot we can learn from this about what I'm calling the matrices and networks of print within which authors worked, flourished and failed, if you like. What caricatures do is they're a kind of negative of the literary portrait. They're showing you those things that we'd sooner not think of when we look at literary portraits in many cases. So I'm quoting Rita Felsky there, her idea of literature being embedded in groupings, assemblies and networks. And it seems to me those assemblies, groupings, networks, the kind of material culture is what's never shown, in fact, in these portraits. Portraits show the end of something rather than point up to that. So there's nothing more prototypical, is there, than Keats's portrait, partly because we know his story. So we're so grateful to see this image of him as a success. But the questions that this raises to me, you know, what is the aim of a portrait in the first place, and what is particularly the aim of a literary portrait? Of course, one aim of a portrait is to always flatter the sitter. It's to produce a likeness, but it's not to produce a likeness that would be unflattering. That would be a strange thing to do. But the aim of a literary portrait, seems to me, it has a further purpose, which is to bring out a certain idea or ideology of the author. And of course, it's in the Romantic period that it reaches a particular kind of, if you like, climax, this idea of autonomous creativity, you know, Romantic ideology itself. So it seems to me that, as this critic Margaret Stetz puts it, what we're looking for here, what these portraits of writers must show us in some sense, is this look of heightened spirituality, thought and intensity, which confirms the fact that there's a creative spark firing the face from within. So, you know, the classic rather dreamy expression, the sense that the writer is now shielded or sheltered from the messy contingencies of both socioeconomics and politics. You know, in a sense, the whole point of the portrait is that that has now been transcended. So I'm suggesting that in some ways we've got to be careful that we don't look at these much loved portraits. This is just one of many that we're all familiar with a sense of this being the last bastion of Romantic ideology, as McGann put it, you know, nearly 40 years ago, where likeness is in state of tension with idealization and what I'm calling this kind of Parnassian narrative closure. I'm not saying that that's not a valid, you know, a valid quality of these portraits, but it's not something that I wanted to write about and just confirm. So where do we find, you know, which genre can encapsulate in any sense the sort of industry of literature, the print culture, which our previous speaker, Kacie, was talking about. And it was interesting that the nearest thing to that in Kacie's talk was, of course, this sketch of pantomime at the popular level, the props in the background and so on. And I want to cite Matt, our esteemed colleague Matt Sangster here. I recommend his recent book, Living as an Author in the Romantic Period. And if you want to try to visualize living as an author in the Romantic period, the nearest we're going to get to it, I would claim, is in the satirical tradition. So, of course, if we go back to Hogarth, we get the kind of antitype of the literary portrait, the distressed poet, surrounded by the materiality of writing, which is, of course, oppressive. It's producing writer's block. It's that pitiless market forces within which all writers are actually immersed, but in some cases we can try to imagine they're not. And of course, another example from Rudolf Ackermann here, again, an extreme case, as you can see, sort of hemmed in and oppressed by the materiality of print. The print that I, of course, start with and make quite a big deal about is Gilray's New Morality, this ensemble piece, which is, of course, an anti-Jacobin print, but what it shows is this sort of paper trail, this animation of print, as opposed to books and pens and desks being static objects, retrospective objects in the literary portrait. Here, everything is participating in this public sphere. Yes, it's seen satirically and in that sense negatively, but it shows this continuity, these connections, these matrices. At the front of this procession is in fact newspapers, the Sedition's Evening Host, before you get the cluster of wandering bards or of the Romantic authors. And it's interesting, just from a purely kind of documentary position here, that the writers who Gilray and the anti-Jacobin thought were most worthy of representation are Southey and Coleridge, and to a lesser extent Lamb, and there's no Wordsworth, even though this is only a couple of months before Lyrical Ballads is published. Wordsworth wasn't known in that sense as a particularly dangerous Jacobin, except by association with the West Country radicals. The next moment after the 1790s I write about, when the issue of the Romantic author sort of comes to the fore in caricature, is of course the poet laureate debacle. Now the poet laureate debacle, which again is Southey, of course, again brings to the fore this tricky and rather, a question that most writers rather forget about, just how to make a living, just how to negotiate those perilous waters of patronage and the marketplace. And both Matt Sangster and Mike Gamer have written very interestingly about this. And so I'm making a little joke here, who would want to be poet laureate? And the answer is but, because the sack butt, the barrel of wine or sherry, which was the traditional gift for taking on the poet laureateship, of course, takes on a rather different function here, with all kinds of innuendos suggesting that Southey's, of course, sold out. That's obvious, but he's incredibly productive. But what he's incredibly productive of, it's implying here is a kind of superficial commodity, literary commodity. But it's a state that all writers are actually contaminated or immersed in, although the literary portrait doesn't always show this. And on the other side is Hone and Cruikshank, who did an interesting take on the previous image, but in fact this was part of a satirical newspaper. So it's even more of an antitype of the literary portrait, because it's now not even a single individually framed object, it's now immersed amidst a whole raft of satirical discourses. And I have, briefly, because I'm getting to the end, I also write about Byron and the sort of aftermath of his involvement in the Southey controversy, because of course he wrote Vision of Judgment, which is one of the texts on the right here, and he's shown in this instance suffering from writer's block, although there's more to say about that print. And then on the other side, the most successful writer of them all, of course, which is Scott, who is shown in a kind of absurdly monumental way with his great magnum opus in this kind of column. It's rather reminiscent of our first speaker talking about those magnificent classical columns in Edinburgh, and Scott sort of figures as this piece of monumental architecture. So that's just an introduction to, oh look, my thing's chiming, to the kind of material I'm dealing with in my chapter. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Impeccable timing, as it happens, eh? And more virtual applause. Thanks again. Our final speaker is Jill Heydt-Stevenson, and I'm going to share the screen for Jill's presentation. I'll pop it up now. Gillian Heydt-Stevenson is Associate Professor of English at the University of Colorado Boulder and the author of Austen's Unbecoming Conjunctions, Subversive Laughter, Embodied History. She has a book currently under review entitled Radiant Matters, Connecting Things in French and British Literature, which I'm dying to see, and is also completing a manuscript on Palmyra and London, Romantic era engagements between East and West. The title of her chapter is The Artwork / in the Romantic Novel. Over to you, Jill.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Sophie, Maureen, and to the BAR's organizers. Before I begin, just a quick note, I'm presenting on a topic different from the one that was in the abstract for our conference, just so no one is confused when I don't talk about The Last Man. Allusions to art, to artists, and to visual methodologies and techniques saturate the Romantic era novel, given as Peter de Bolle demonstrates that, quote, mid-18th century Britain was obsessed with visibility, spectacle, and display, end quote. Perhaps it is no wonder that novelists turn to the images from and techniques of the fine arts in order to introduce into their literary work such a culture of visuality. William Hazlitt writes that, quote, it is a luxury to have the walls of our rooms hung round with them, and to no less to have, quote, a gallery in the mind, end quote. For those lacking paintings on their walls, literature could offer some recompense by giving readers such a mental depository. Northanger Abbey's Catherine Morland, in fact, possesses this when she says that she never looks at England's beach and cliff, quote, without thinking about the south of France, end quote. She has not literally been to southern France, but the ekphrastic descriptions in Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho galvanize for her an inner pictorial life. In the chapter that I wrote for this volume, I first examine how writers draw on the methods the fine arts practice in order to expand their own narrative techniques. Second, I ask what possibilities arise when artists and artistic styles are quoted in a novel. Third, and this is the subject of today's talk, I investigate the interpretive prospects that unfold when publications include images illustrating the text. The book illustration establishes physical and intimate relationships between images and words, one sparking imaginative interweavings between the two mediums, while breaking down binary oppositions too often posited between them. In today's talk, I focus on the 5th edition, 1803, of Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, which includes 4 engravings, each prefacing a new volume, encouraging readers to see the image before reading the passage and to navigate physically between text and illustration. I make 2 central points. First, whether an image appears near or far from a description it illustrates, readers, to take in both, must actively and vitally move their eyes, their fingers and hands back and forth through the novel's pages. Daniel Stern claims that, quote, vitality has a basis in physical action and traceable mental operations, and energies such as movement, time, force, space, and directionality create dynamic events, end quote. Illustrations referring to passages, and even more so, to multiple passages simultaneously, become dynamic events when readers, sensorially and intellectually engaged, participate in switchback reading and looking. The second point I'll make is that book illustrations, or at least the one I'll be discussing today, function effectively like quotations inserted into a text. These, Mary Orr argues, quote, re-energize, serving as the locus of a simultaneously magnetic centripetal and counter-magnetic centrifugal force, end quote. The image that you have before you illustrates this moment from the novel. Quote, having reached a green summit shadowed by palm trees and overlooking the valleys and plains of Gascony, the Saint-Aubert family seated themselves on the turf. And while their eyes wandered over the glorious scene and they inhaled the sweet breath of flowers and herbs that enriched the grass, Emily played and sung several of their favorite airs, end quote. This illustration to link Stearns and Orr's terms becomes a dynamic event, since it initially moves readers magnetically to this passage by replicating the description of the family and of the setting. Then it moves the reader counter-magnetically from the passage, for in the novel, they gaze on the landscape, but the illustration renders the countryside a mere backdrop. The counter-magnetic movement conspicuously veers from Radcliffe's tendencies to make nature itself a character rather than a stage set, and to encourage enjoyment. Quote, eyes that wander over the glorious scene, end quote, delight in the spiritualized universe. Thus, the reader, avidly moving between image and text, would note that this illustration diminishes human landscape conversance by favoring familial socializing. Yet, ironically, it isolates the subjects from each other, a state structurally affected by the triangle, which moves the viewer from Madame to her husband and to their daughter, and which prevents viewers from seeing them as a mutually engaged group, as they are, for example, in the novel. Instead, each parent watches Emily, who looks away. In emphasizing isolation, the illustration refers obliquely to a different paragraph, another counter-magnetic move, one forecasting future grief and loss. Quote, music and conversation detained them till the gloom of evening stole over the landscape. Saint-Aubert and his family left the place with regret. Alas, Madame Saint-Aubert knew not that she left it forever, end quote. The illustration in isolating the figures compresses into one spatial temporal zone many events: family love and loss, present and future, death and life. For example, the mother's headgear undergirds her coming death. Although it favors 16th century hoods French women wore, its long white drape and conical shape resembles a shroud. Moreover, Emily's vacant gaze into a mysterious fourth wall crystallizes her future loss, even in this moment when all live. Such inter-image textuality, as I am calling it, underscores how an illustration, unlike a copy, creates a dynamic event wherein the image becomes its own interpreter of and offers a vital exchange with that text and with readers. As a dynamic event, the illustration energizes the reader's interpretive impulses. However, it also could be said to offer its own reading of the novel, a conservative one. Solving family secrets and finding what is real become the heroine's responsibility. This is what Alison Conway would call its, quote, private interests, a term defining a new commitment to the domestic and personal life as the origin of social unity and cooperation, a doctrine that looks to women to guarantee the integrity of the private sphere, end quote. In this sense, this image is itself a frontispiece. That is, as the multigraph collective writes, an image, quote, at the beginning of a book intended to structure readers' expectations and interactions with that book, end quote. For example, The isolation in the human triangle that dominates the engraving directs attention to what might be a disturbing energy at the family's core. For in this first volume, Emily will, shortly after her mother's death, covertly observe her father holding a miniature picture, quote, not of her mother, that he holds to his lips and then to his heart, sighing with a convulsive force, end quote. St. Aubert's seeming infidelity shocks Emily. Quote, she could scarcely believe what she saw to be real, end quote. This mystery is not solved until 2 chapters from the novel's conclusion. After completing Udolpho, vital traversing's with fingers and eyes between image and text reveal that the illustration does not just introduce us to volume 1, but functions as a frontispiece illuminating that this family and its secrets structure the entire novel. Reseeing this frontispiece, after all the enigmas are revealed, the reader reaffirms the family's integrity, to requote Alison Conway. With this in mind, the parents' contemplation of Emily in this frontispiece also suggests that they look to her here at the very beginning to solve the dangerous riddles that will for a time haunt her life. In conclusion, a tradition of competition between word and image exists, one that, as W.J.T. Mitchell explores, has ideological ramifications, especially in gender terms, wherein, quote, paintings like women are ideally silent, beautiful creatures designed for the gratification of the eye, in contrast to the sublime eloquence proper to the manly art of poetry, end quote. However, what we have seen here is that the 2 modes together offer an enhanced experience of affective and intellectual vitality in reading and viewing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our speakers. So we've now heard from 5 of our contributors who have given us a sense really of the different aspects of the volume as a whole and thus its scope. But of course, this is inevitably just a selection. Other chapters address wide-ranging topics, including illustrated magazines, visual spectacles, theater, fashion, household objects and design, comics, film, heritage, and digital humanities. The volume also makes space for new approaches to familiar topics, such as connoisseurship, landscape, and travel. But what we think is distinctive about the Companion is exactly this extensive range of intermedial cultural productions, from popular to elite, and from the public to the domestic sphere. We are also pleased that the authors of the essays are themselves an international interdisciplinary group, including not only literary scholars, but also art historians and curators. In mirroring the period's own preoccupations with visual culture, the range of topics, materials, and approaches included in the Edinburgh Companion to Romanticism and the Arts reflects the inroads scholars have made, while suggesting new directions for future research. And now I'd like to invite all of the panelists to come back on screen so that we can invite your questions from the audience.
We have questions. I think people are formulating questions in their minds. We've got a question for Laura, and I think what we might do, Maureen and I had come up with a sort of potted question that we thought we might put to everybody. Maybe we'll do that. We'll do a kind of round of an inflicted question while people add their questions into the chat as they digest and think about the different short presentations that you've heard. Maureen, do you want to read our question out to our panel? Maybe we'll ask you to just answer in order of presentation.
Yeah, so obviously Sophie and I had our own kind of ideas about what we wanted the collection to do and to include. I think we came up with something that we felt was quite focused and comprehensive, but reading this range, I guess we're really wondering how the contributors view or think about how a more focused attention to visual studies might fruitfully shape future research in our fields. And maybe some of that is coming out of kind of being forced to work within this this companion, the parameters that we've set.
Are we going in order? I just wanted to say I truly enjoyed listening to all of those presentations, and one of the things that I think is so exciting about this volume is that it really addresses what, you know, in performance studies we call the extra textual surround of materials and artistic practices and literary practices, and sort of the performative aspects of everyday life that affect writers and artists and performers and, you know, general viewers in the Romantic period. So I think being conscious of that, and Ian talked about this, and Ian Haywood talked about this in his presentation, the sort of the matrix, the backgrounds around matrix, and to think also about, you know, Gillian's reference to the idea of what happens to a reader when we are inspired by illustration, also connects what Romantic viewers were perhaps experiencing with all of these aesthetic forms at that time to how we're experiencing these forms today, and sort of thinking about that connection. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the things that are running around in my brain.
Yeah, I was in your talk as well. I was thinking about that kind of how interconnected people were, and how there was a liveliness to this kind of circulation and consumption, and even networks of people. I mean, in Beauclerk's case, maybe the upper echelons of society, but certainly I'm thinking about kind of, you know, Wedgwood's connections with the Devonshires, and Georgiana's intimate relationship with Beauclerk, and those kind of all of that cross-fertilization as well. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if anybody else from the panel wants to jump in on that, or if maybe Alison has.
Yeah, I was, you know, I really enjoyed listening to all of the papers. And one of the things that really struck me listening to them is that the way in which all of these different talks are kind of, yeah, recuperating the visual, the kind of visual culture of this period in ways that maybe we've kind of overlooked for a while, but just to think about, you know, not just like, you know, what Kacie saw, the spectacle of the stage, but also the prints that circulate around it and kind of refer to it, or Gillian's talk about, you know, a kind of frontispiece and how it sort of directs or invites the reader or prompts the reader in different kinds of ways or raises questions. And just thinking about, you know, the images that I talked about are from illustrated topographies, but how much kind of, you know, the world of kind of, you know, text and image kind of sit side by side in ways that we don't always get in the modern editions of kind of, you know, things that we teach in the classroom. And so it was just really nice to kind of, yeah, have a moment. And I suppose thinking about, you know, the kind of the print caricatures, and thinking about, you know, kind of print shop windows, and how this, you know, perhaps before even you kind of had a chance to read Keats, somebody might have seen an image or a satire, or, you know, and so the ways in which the kind of constant dialogue, and and what it might have been like to have been a Romantic period sort of reader, or just person kind of, you know, constantly engaging with images in all different kind of formats that invite you to think about things that you then also go on to read about or see on stage or engage with in other ways.
Yeah, and I think in your case with topography as well, people have more access and are to that and see that. That's a more popular, it's not, you know, for people who are getting prints and things like that, it's not a strange thing to encounter, but it's certainly kind of connected with what ideologically is happening in the periodicals and the kind of framing of Edinburgh in this wider way. And so there's this kind of mirroring or reverberation of or echo between the print culture and the visual culture. Oh, we do have some questions coming in. Sophie, would we like to keep going through?
Yeah, well, Kacie was poised, so
yeah.
maybe.
Okay,
Feel free to. Yeah, we'll do a short. We'll finish this.
I'm just going back and forth.
I know we've got a couple of really good questions in the chat now, but I think we'll let Kacie and Ian and Jill tackle this question before we move on. Yeah, sounds.
Thanks. Yeah, I just really quickly, because I think I brought this up in my talk as well, but this moment after contact between Europeans and the people in the Pacific was so integral in shaping people's worldview. And without studying visual culture and the print culture and the ways print culture got taken up in other spectacles like pantomime, we're really missing out on how people were popularly understanding the knowledge that was gleaned through this experience. Additionally, I think it's opening up avenues for us to think about not just how Europeans were representing Indigenous populations, but the other way around. So the rest of my chapter talks about Tupaya and his illustrations that for a long time were thought to be done by Joseph Banks, but actually were his. And I end my chapter actually by thinking about that Reynolds Oh My portrait and just how central it is to Britain's conception of its own history. And so I think that alone and the fact there's still a lot of controversy around its ownership and who should be able to access it and see it speaks to how central these visual depictions of Pacific Indigenous peoples are to our own history.
Am I next? Sorry.
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
To respond, yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Great to be in such good company. And what's this confirms to me is the power of the image. And one thing I'm particularly interested in is the relativity of the power of text against the power of the image. I think the tendency has been that to maybe think, well, the image has an immediate impact, but it doesn't have the same kind of afterlife. And I think that's as a text. So the text is more enduring than the image. And I think all this work is maybe starting to reverse perhaps that. I was thinking of Peter Otto's book, Multiplying Worlds, where he almost argues it's a kind of virtual reality on offer through all these visual sources. And I just want to illustrate how endlessly, what keeps me fresh in a sense with research is finding some new image of something or some sort of link. When I was giving a talk about Ottobah Koguanu, the Black British writer who features in this fancy portrait of the Causeways, which is, very unflattering when you think of what he was actually doing as an abolitionist. But in fact, he lived with the Causeways in Schomburg House. Schomburg House was absolutely right in the middle of the literary galleries in Pall Mall. So it's not just that he figures in the visual representation, he in a sense was living that culture. He was actually immersed right within it. So then you can think, well, there's got to be more to say about that visual dimension of his work as well, not just the connection. So this is all the time refreshing my research. So I think this is a great testimony, today's panel, to this, that it's still producing great insights.
It's the generative relationship, between all these moving parts, that they keep moving, but in different orbits and in different, on different collision courses, that generate so much excitement for us. Yeah, Jill, you were going to comment too on this.
Yeah, first of all, I think the question is terrific, that how might more focused attention to visual studies fruitfully shape future research in our field. And I've been thinking about this. Certainly, the paper that I gave and the chapter that I wrote as a whole studies how the fine arts influence narrative technique. And I'm not sure that if somebody can point me to people who have done more of that, I would be grateful, but I haven't found that much. I think it also might help us rethink or reinforce ideas about the novel as a genre. You know, D.H. Lawrence said you can put anything you want in a novel, right? And that's great. But what does it mean to have a painting or in a novel? What does it mean to have just an artist referenced without a painting? Does that mean that we're looking at one aspect of the painter's style or the whole of the oeuvre of the painter? I think also it creates more the possibility for greater pedagogical expectations. And again, you know, my focus has been on the novel. So I'm thinking about, you know, the fear of the novel, the fear of the immorality of the novel, but the greater pedagogical expectations seem to me rather stunning, given that you have to know something about art in order to understand why the artist has put it there. But even if you don't, you create, as I said at the beginning of my talk, this mental depository, you know, such that you come to think you know what a Claude looks like, even if you may never have seen one. And, you know, I mean, I have more to say, but I'll stop. I think it just puts more wonderful pressure on us to rethink this idea that the image and the word are in competition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got two really good general questions in the chat now. And there was one very specific one for Laura as well. Actually, Laura, I wonder if you'd like to answer the question that was directed specifically to your paper before we look at the two broader questions. One speaks very much, I think, to what Jill was just saying.
Sure. Do you want to read the question again? It was about the relationship between amateur artists and professional engravers. And could I say more about that? I would love to be able to say more about that. And potentially there is someone on the call, someone on the Zoom who has written extensively about that. But what I can say is that I think Diana Beauclerk was a really savvy marketer. I think she chose her subject matter wisely. I think after she did her image of Georgiana, and that was engraved and it was a huge success. Then she took her beautiful pastel of her daughters, and Bartolozzi was happy to engrave that. So it's a kind of behind the scenes network question, a little bit related to what we were talking about before with, you know, sort of what is the history of these kinds of networks? How do people get their work seen, especially women? There are a lot of people working on terrific things relating to women in printmaking. Cynthia Roman and Christina Rodriguez are about to publish a book, a collection on that very subject. So, so that is my roundabout answer to that question. Thank you, whoever asked it.
There was someone named admin who might identify themselves later. So yeah, Matt's put a question in the chat, and there's also one from Jeannie, which maybe is the one we'll start with, because I think it speaks to a number of things that have come up in the last few minutes. Jeannie, do you want to ask the question directly, or would you like us to read it? We don't mind.
Everybody hear me? Sure.
Yeah.
I'm frightened of being interrupted by children, so I'll try to get this out quickly. First of all, this was fantastic. I'm so excited to see the book. And I'm just curious about what you guys would say if you want to even bother responding to the old-fashioned argument that Romanticism is all about the denigration of the visual. I mean, no, it's not. That's obvious from all of the work that you're doing and all of the work that's already been done. But I guess I'm curious about why that claim happened in the first place, why it had a sort of lingering effect in some critical conversations. And the answer that I've been sort of tossing around in my head was, is it because we have so much more access now that we can really get a firmer picture of what the picture was in the Romantic period? Like, what would you say about that kind of critical history, I guess?
maybe I can leap in here, because as the person who set up the Romantic Illustration Network, I think we were driven initially just by the inaccuracy of that sort of account of the Romantic period, in the sense that once the copyright law, changed in the 1780s, the main way in which value was added to editions of poetry was through the addition of illustrations. And then we discovered that, in fact, most Royal Academy artists made their money from designing illustrations, in fact, rather than, selling, glossy, glitzy paintings at the Royal Academy. So it just seemed inaccurate. But I suppose that it relates probably to how long it took to open up the canon, didn't it? So, the portraits I began with, Keats, and I could have shown Shelley and a number of other writers, is this sort of ultimate in canonization. And there was trying to suggest that it closes down debate. It doesn't invite you to look beyond those writers themselves and their works. So it's a rather sealed economy, wasn't it? And the work that started to open this up a bit was more focused probably on visual spectacle, things like panoramas and something. I suppose going back to Altick's book, The Shows of London, which actually was ahead of its time, really. I mean, 20 years ahead of its time, probably, and would never get published now, by the way. Your point is a good one, but he would never get permissions for all those images for that book, would he? Hundreds of images, none of them with permissions. But so I think now we're burrowing down deeper, aren't we, into the actual, the print culture much more widely, and rightly so. I think there was an absence in my talk, which of course was images of women, and I did give Maureen and Sophie a long final footnote, sort of apologising almost for not finding any satirical images of women writers, which is a kind of doubly damning in a way, because it's almost saying they're not worthy of being satirised. But if anyone finds any, I'd like you to send them to me, please.
There's some great ones of Elizabeth Inchbald.
And Piazzi, I think.
Great. I'll send them to you. But I just want to say that I think some of this has to do with this sort of the term interdisciplinarity, which some people love and some people don't love. I come to Romanticism from the visual arts and from theater. So, those disciplines have often been sort of thought of as separate genres. If you're doing the novel, you're doing the novel. If you're doing poetry, you're doing the poetry. How is interdisciplinarity working? And I think that that's one of the reasons why this persists in some ways, although I think that it's breaking down.
I think we also see some shifts even as material culture itself kind of, material culture is really one of those wonderful spaces that are actually, it takes so long for real interdisciplinary type things to bed down. And now that they have, I think, and this increased focus on material culture and looking at that again, I think it's also maybe opening up the boundaries that have been placed, say, on art history that has been closed, that maybe hasn't looked at pottery or ceramics in any meaningful way before. And so now we can kind of play with, transfer pottery as lit scholars and art historians, and because of those cross currents, and we can see that. And yeah, I think as Ian was saying, we're not just reading the poem and thinking about Wordsworth's mind, but we're it's richer because we are looking at the actual landscapes the physical landscapes that he's then moving beyond. So I wanted to finish up with Matt's question, because we're heading towards our time. Matt was asking, or saying, that several of the talks discussed ways in which images were carefully framed and manipulated to try and gather what might be described as the quintessence of a thing. So Edinburgh or Omai, authorship, Udolpho, perhaps Spencer, although that may be more complex. Is this something you'd consider a guiding principle for visual art in the period, or is that too simple?
I'd like to speak to that. It's an interesting question. What my sense of the illustration in the book is that no matter how carefully framed, no matter how sort of manufactured an interpretation might be, this movement, and that's why I brought in vitality, this movement back and forth really undermines that sense that there could be this carefully manipulated frame or point of view or perspective for the reader, that the reader is necessarily going to shake that up simply by the moving back and forth process.
If I could jump in as well, I was thinking about again, like sort of illustrated topographies, but thinking about that idea about the difficulty. Yeah, does that suggest the difficulty of getting at the quintessence of something that you have image after image from different angles or different aspects? But even thinking about Calton Hill, there's Lady Mary Elton does a series of views from the top, so you get the kind of full circle. And of course, once you're kind of getting the view out, you can't get the view of, which is a kind of different story. So I think that, yeah, that attempt to kind of get at things, but also realizing that, you know, what's sort of just beyond and what's kind of just out of reach of the image. And if I could just also say very quickly about Jeannie's question, I suppose your question made me kind of think about like what happened to all the stuff, you know, so probably part of the story is like what happens to particularly maybe items that were once ephemeral, and how, you know, is there a kind of maybe a 19th century history of moving into private collections and then ending up later at kind of research libraries pre-digitization, and so we just think it doesn't exist. But I think it's a really interesting question that it does exist, and it has maybe a particular kind of value sort of post-romantic period, but hidden in a kind of private collection that doesn't really see much. But yeah, it made me think, like, where did all the stuff go that no one thought it was there?
Country houses, I'm sure.
I can add to that Matthew's question really quick, because I think the question of like framing and designating something as, or some person as having these quintessential qualities happens so much with especially the representation of Indigenous people in art and visual culture. And there's been some really wonderful work. I'm thinking just of Harriet Guest's essay on the Reynolds portrait, for example, and Omai's tattoos, that the more people are looking at these paintings, the more we're developing these readings sort of against the grain that are really revealing the complicated nature of representing Indigenous persons in visual art, and how oftentimes what happens is all of these, you know, European ideas get dumped on to the representation of the person, and we can really see, again, Guest's article is on my mind, but the sort of contradictions in British culture, especially about masculinity, and so forth, that are being represented in the Omai portrait. So.
If I could just chip in just for a minute, I think Matt's question's a good one. I think the question of the frame, of course, is absolutely crucial, both literally and metaphorically, as we've just heard. But the whole question of the movement of an image from a big frame, as in above the line, you know, in the Royal Academy, the same image, in a sense, then gets moved via engraving into a book, where it becomes sort of miniaturized. And that's something that does require, I think, a lot more work, you know, we speak about those two sometimes in the same way, not taking into account maybe what needs to change, or different types of literacy when you're looking at the small rather than the big. In some cases, you only look at the small because you can't get access to the big. And so Derrida's point about the paragon, I think he calls it, doesn't he, is absolutely crucial. And one of the points I was going to make about caricature is of course, the gilded frame of the literary portrait is no obstacle at all to the caricaturist. So nothing, you know, there's no private space that they will not intrude themselves into. And again, I think that marks, in a sense, that marks them out for, for special treatment. So anyway, yeah, very good question. I don't believe in essence, by the way. So I think, our studies are all anti-essentialist in that sense.
That's probably a great note to kind of draw things in on too. I noticed Francesca pointing everybody in the chat towards details of the next event, and people are of course needing to sign off to do things like, make supper and take care of other family members. So I think Maureen and I would like to thank our speakers. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much for writing for the collection. I know people are also in the audience who are writing chapters for the collection as well. And we feel like we're very privileged to be part of a really lovely community of scholars and writers working in a really fascinating field. Maureen, do you want to add anything to that before we draw a line under it?
No, just add my thanks to that as well. And I believe that the BARS committee was going to just make a quick announcement, but I also wanted to thank BARS for doing the digital panels. I think it's been really wonderful during this time. I've certainly enjoyed them over the last few months and staying connected with everybody. So thank you for that.
Thanks for that beautiful cue into the next topic. And thanks to Maureen and Sophie and to all the speakers for a really wonderful session. I've really enjoyed this. I just wanted to appear briefly at the end to plug something that BARS will be doing in the summer, which is the Romantic Disconnections Reconnections Conference. Obviously, we've had to delay our joint conference with NASA at Edge Hill until 2022 in the current situation, but we thought we would try and have something in the summer to try and reconnect the Romantic Studies community a bit. We realize we are inviting technical failures throughout the conference with this title, but we thought it was nevertheless appropriate. So I put the website in the chat, it's there on the slide that Colette is sharing. At the moment, we're inviting presentations or inviting submissions for short presentations along the lines that we've been doing in this series. So 10-minute presentations. We'll have slightly shorter sessions so people aren't on Zoom for the whole time. We're very keen to sort of foster discussion, which is what I think we've all been missing over this sort of period. So this is why you want slightly shorter papers. That also relates to the second kind of call that we've put out, which is for salons, which are more informal sessions where we'd like a person or a small group of people to propose a topic they would like to have a conversation around, such as the kinds of conversations you might have over terrible coffee at a physical conference. And we'll advertise sessions for those, and people can just sort of come together and have conversations about medical humanities or a particular poem or anything that they would like to. We're happy for you to be very creative with those if you're interested in doing that. So the conference will happen on sort of two split up sets of dates, so as not to keep people on Zoom. We're going to try and keep the days on the sort of run of sessions on those days quite short as well. So Thursday the 12th and Friday the 13th of August, and Thursday the 19th and Friday the 20th of August. Plenaries, Mary Fairclough, whose work on connections and disconnections in crowds and in electrical terms you'll know, and Oren Wong, who's going to preface to trail some new work he's been doing on media and mediation. We also are going to have roundtables on heritage and representation and on eco-critical connections and disconnections. There you can find more details on the site. But if you would like to come along, it costs only as much as it costs to join BARS, which is not very much. So please do consider putting in paper proposals and solemn proposals. The deadline is the 28th of June, which is a Monday, not too far in the future. But anyway, I hope you will come along to that. And thanks very much for coming along to the session. And thanks to the speakers and the organizers again.